Excellent. Okay, well, welcome to the session for the Center of Excellence for Health. I am extremely excited to be here. I am the lead for the Center of Excellence for Health, Deneen Diamond. I am so happy to introduce my guest, John Fletcher. John Fletcher and I met when I very first started this position in September, and he's been a fabulous mentor to me and helping me kind of, I guess, navigate the mental health system here in the province. And he has so much to offer. I'm really excited to just give a really short bio. John Fletcher hails from the mighty Miramichi. As Amanda said, if you're from Miramichi, you're good. He is a licensed counselor, therapist, small-scale farmer, entrepreneur, podcaster, father of four, husband to one, and avid fly fisherman. John is extremely busy, has beautiful kids, and I will say that I listen to his podcast while I walk in the morning. And if you want to check out his podcast, I'm sure he'll speak about it. But it is on the website at the Center of Excellence for Health, and it's Fishing for Mental Health. I highly recommend it for if you do maybe walks by yourself, or even if you want to put it on in the background while you're cooking dinner. I know my husband and I have listened to it while we drive. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the mighty John Fletcher, and we are so blessed to have you. Thank you so much and welcome.
Well, thank you, Deneen, for the kind words and the introduction, and for the invitation to speak to all of you today for our mental health month, and talking about a couple topics that I'm very passionate about. So I'm kind of marrying my passion for farming, which you'll learn a little bit about today, and using that as really a metaphor for understanding mental health from an ecological perspective, which might be a little bit different than maybe some of us look at mental health. So I'm going to get rolling. So that's our title for today, Farming for Mental Health. And to set this up, I want to, like I said, I want to use farming as a metaphor for health. And personally, myself as a human being, I'm really interested in finding ways to help things thrive. So if it's my crops, which I grow a lot of corn and pumpkins and different things, and sunflowers, I really want them to grow and thrive, not just survive. I want them to thrive. If it's my animals, which Deneen and I were talking a little bit about pack goats, which is another area where I'm not going to talk a lot about today. I want my animals to thrive as well. My children, my clients, when I'm working as a therapist, I just really want people and things I interact with to be the best they can be, to reach the highest potential that they have. So when I'm looking at and I will talk about farming for a little bit to set this up. So we have a small hobby farm up here in Miramichi. We run a corn maze attraction, which is a pretty big tourism attraction here in the fall. And I grow a big field of about 5 acres of corn. This isn't actually the picture of my field, but it looks similar to that. And we grow a big field of sunflowers for pictures and photo ops and all that, and about a couple thousand pumpkins. And then we're growing a big plot of sweet corn this year. And when I first got into, I mean, I grew up on a farm, so agriculture and farming is kind of in my blood. But when I got back into it when we moved back home a couple of years ago, or sorry, 5 or 6 years ago, I was thinking, okay, I got to get these proper seeds, right? Because when I grow for a corn maze, I need to make sure my corn's 8 or 9 feet tall. I want the really tall variety. So genetics are important. When I grow giant pumpkins, I need to get specific seeds so they can grow really, really big. My sunflowers and my regular pumpkins and my sweet corn, genetics is really important. But when I first started this, I was kind of focused more on, if I got good seeds, that's all I need. But then I learned the hard way. Our very first year growing our big plot of field corn, about 95% of the field grew really well, just like in this picture. But then there was about 5%, this strip that went across our field, that was stunted, and it only grew about 4 or 5 feet high. And that doesn't work very good for a corn maze, with the exception of little kids. And it freaked me out. I didn't know what was going on. And my go-to response was, okay, I just need to add some more chemicals. I need to add more fertilizer, which we literally apply metric tons of fertilizer. So I was like, well, that's not the issue. Then someone said, well, maybe put spray fertilizer on top of the leaves. And that actually did work temporarily. It gave it a boost, got some nutrients kicked back in. But I really needed to get to the root of the issue, which I ended up finding out through talking to my father and other farmers. And they said, well, you probably have something going on in your soil, in your ecosystem. There's something going on in the ecology. The seeds are fine because 95% of the field grew, but for this one section, there's something going on in the soil. After some soil sampling and talking to some other farming experts, we realized that there was an imbalance in my pH levels, because it used to be an old ridge line on this old farming property that my great grandfather had. He used to pile a lot of the rocks there, and it made that part of the field really acidic. And when your acidity is too high, your crop's ability to suck up the nutrients is impeded, so it can't grow and thrive. It survived, but it didn't thrive. So this really changed my view. And then, listening to other farmers and people in agriculture and gardeners, anybody that really knows what they're talking about, they preach soil health, the ecosystem, because you may look like a handful of dirt, but it's an actual ecosystem. There's fungi, there's microbacteria, there's micronutrients, macronutrients, pH, there's acidity and alkaline. There's all kinds of things happening in that dirt. And what happens is, if there's something out of balance, like that strip of my cornfield, it inhibited my corn's ability to thrive. So the next year, I also am really passionate about trying to grow giant pumpkins. I'm still new in the game, and my goal is to one day grow like 1,000-pounder, and I'm working my way up there. A couple of years ago, I said, well, I'm going to do a little experiment. Sometimes I kind of like to pretend to be a scientist. I said, okay, I'm going to see how much this ecological versus kind of individual seed really works. So I took 2 groups of pumpkins, my giant pumpkins, and one of them I really nurtured, and I really made sure the ecological health, the soil had lots of nutrients, had lots of moisture, especially during droughts. I really put a lot of time and effort into really nurturing this one plant. The second plant, I literally just plucked the seeds in the ground and said, okay, you're on your own, see what happens. Now, keep in mind, identical seeds, they probably came from the exact same pumpkin. So genetically, like identical twins. The end of the year, the pumpkins that I really put a lot of time and effort into keeping the ecological health nice and healthy, I ended up with, at that time, the biggest giant pumpkin I had, probably a couple 100 pounds. The other plant wasn't even big for like a regular pumpkin. And that, to me, it really just confirmed what I already knew anyways, but it confirmed that we really need to, in farming and in gardening, and if any of you people garden. Mr. Volpe, call the office. I'm in a school, so pardon if there's any interruptions in the background. If any of you are familiar with gardening, you understand how important that ecological soil health is. And this really was, and it's funny because at the same time, I do a lot of work in resilience from an ecological perspective, and Michael Ungar's work, if you're familiar with him, and he talks about resilience from an ecological perspective. And it just kind of clicked, and I'm like, oh, this is just like humans. Humans are the same thing. We a lot of times focus on an individual intervention for someone, where really a lot of times we really need to make sure the ecosystem around the human is balanced. And when it's not, it can impede on that individual human's ability to grow and thrive and be the best version they can be. So there are, in farming, in growing crops, there's kind of these big things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, our pH levels, some of our micronutrients, and our moisture. And there's different things that we really need to make sure they're balanced. Humans are the same thing. And I'm going to talk about today these 5 pillars of mental health that I've been doing. I've been in this field for over a decade. I do a lot of reading, and I have quite a bit of experience as a clinician as well, and even just reflecting on my own experience. There's these 5 pillars that keep on coming up that we really need to tune into for our own mental health and ensure that they're balanced, because when they're not, our mental health is jeopardized. So we're going to go over 5 of them. Before I start, I think someone is unmuted because I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So if you can just mute your microphone, that'd be greatly appreciated. So these 5 pillars. The first one is social connectedness. And what this is how tightly connected we are in having a good social group. So friends, family, colleagues, people that we're connected to. Now, the bad news is we are the most socially disconnected than we've ever been in history. And some of you may be thinking, oh, well, we're 2 years after a pandemic. Well, The worst news is this was before the pandemic happened. This has been accumulating since basically the 1950s or 60s. That's when we started to see loneliness start to come on the scene and increase with every passing generation, from the baby boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials, which is I am, and now the Gen Z, that it would be my children's age group and our students that we're teaching. So this loneliness, the social connectedness has been increasing. And then now you throw in a pandemic where we actually had to physically isolate from each other, and it just kind of added gas to an already existing fire. So social connectedness is super important. It's something that we've really, as from a societal perspective, we've really neglected, and we're starting to see, I'm seeing it in my clinical work, we're seeing the ramifications of this on our mental health. Now, we have to keep in mind, when we step back more than just to the 1950s and 60s, if we go back 200, 300,000 years, the modern human, that how long they've been alive, or how long we've been alive as a species, we've evolved in very tightly knit kin groups for 99.9%, really up until not even 100 years ago. We've been really tightly knit with our communities, with our family, with our friends. And the last 60, 80 years, this has started to break away. Now, there's all kinds of reasons, and I'm not going to go into all the details today on what every particular reason. You know, some people will blame cell phones, some people will blame social media. I would say all of the above and more. Our houses are bigger. We have less kids. Our communities are not nearly tightly as connected. Our schools, think of a one-room school that my grandmother, who's still alive, she's going to be 99 this summer, she taught in a one-room school. And I talked to her a lot about what life was like and just how tightly connected communities were and schools were. All of these things have just changed, right? So we're not evolved to be isolated. And I think we've all realized this, especially the last 2 years. But we haven't been able to deal with social isolation, disconnection, and it really is impeding on our ability to function and our mental health. The very first thing I do when I meet a client, and last night I had a new intake with a client at the clinic I work at on Monday nights, and one of the first things I do before we get into any cognitive behavioral therapy or any kind of complex therapy is, what does your social support network look like? That is usually my very first question, because when we are very tightly connected, we can overcome incredible amounts of adversity, because we have for 200 to 300,000 years, right? If you think of all the adversities the human species would have faced from just trying to survive when we didn't have comfortable houses and all the kind of creature comforts we have nowadays. So we need to really prioritize this stuff. One of my tips when I talk about social connectedness is, first step is just reflect on who do you have in your corner, right? If it's looking a little thin, we're adults. We need to either, if we can't figure it out on our own, we need to reach out for support from a friend, family member, or maybe even a professional, and we need to get more people in our corner. And this doesn't mean virtual connections. We have this really weird imbalance between virtual connectedness and interpersonal connectedness. And like, you know, the joke that someone who has 1,000 Facebook friends but has a hard time kind of naming 5 people they connect with on a regular basis. So these are things I know we all know. It's not anything new or anything that we're not aware of, but it is something we have been neglecting, and it is impacting our mental health. We don't function as a species very well when we're not very socially connected. So one tip I give people, I call it the relationship plus minus, is to just like a T-chart, which you're probably all familiar with being teachers, and put a plus and a minus, or a minus and a plus. And you can either write down the characteristics, or you can write down actual people's names. Who are people that kind of are dragging you down, and who are people that are lifting you up? And it's as simple as spend more time with the people in the plus category, and maybe don't necessarily cut them out of your lives, but limit your contact with people that are dragging you down. And what you'll notice, there's a chemical reaction when we're around people who really lift us up. Dopamine gets released, all the feel-good chemicals, our oxytocin, that love chemical, all those things that we need to function in a healthy way gets released when we are hanging around people who lift us up. So I just want to highlight, this is an issue we really need to focus on. And then when you're thinking, now take off the individual hat and put the teacher hat back on, and when you're thinking of the classroom, thinking of your students, what does their social connectedness look like? If they don't have it at home, the second best place is school, right? If a student is not getting what they need at home, from learning to our SEL skills or our mental health foundational skills, the second best place is school. So, but keep in mind, the best thing you can do for your kids is to make sure you're socially connected, because if you're socially connected, it's contagious. They will pick up off of that. If you're feeling really lonely and isolated and you're trying to help everybody else, you just burn yourself out. So that's pillar number one, really focusing on social connectedness and really reflecting on what can you do on a daily basis to make sure you prioritize this. Because not only mental health, there's actually tons of research. The Harvard Grant study is one of the biggest longitudinal studies they've done, and not only mental health benefits, but aging long and with high quality of life. One of the biggest themes is this social connectedness piece. And I know my grandmother, who's 99, it isn't the only reason why she's living so well into her old age, but she is one of the most socially connected people I know currently. Like between retirement teacher functions and card parties and bridge parties, she is so socially connected. I truly think that is one significant variable on why she is so healthy in approaching 100 here next year. So that's pillar number one. Number two is physical activity, and I actually meant to change because exercise can have a negative or a positive connotation, but physical activity. We know there's tons of research that the benefits of physical activity. We know the dopamine, adrenaline, all the good chemicals will kind of get that runner's high, that exercise high, whatever you want to call it. There's tons of benefits to being physically active. And when we look at things once again from a long-term macro view, from an evolutionary perspective, we are a moving species. Up until maybe 100 years ago, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, so maybe 150 years ago, give or take, we've been very active. Now, it wasn't going to the gym in the old days. It was going out working on a farm. It was logging. It was taking care of 10 kids, all kinds of different things. We were very physically active. That has slowed down. Just like social connectedness, we are the most physically inactive than we've ever been in history. And there are dire mental and physical effects of living a sedentary lifestyle. And I know this personally. I have an office job I have now for the last 5 or 6 years. And my physical activity is not where it should be. I'm trying to build in more, go for walks at lunchtime and so on to kind of break that routine. But there's something primitive that when we exercise, our body kind of wakes up primitively and goes, oh, okay. And it functions better mentally and physically. Now, the cool thing is, from my understanding, it doesn't really matter what type of exercise or physical activity you do. You don't have to go to the gym and lift weights. You don't have to do spin. You don't have to do CrossFit. It's really as long as you're moving. That's what your body wants, because it's been ingrained for 99.9% of our evolution as a species. So finding something that works for you is key. If you're the worst thing is going to try to do something that you just hate, but you're trudging through it. Find an activity that works for you. If it's yoga, if it's CrossFit, whatever, your body and your brain will reward you. And the one that I do recommend out of all other exercise or physical activities is plain old walking. And there's a couple of reasons. One, it is incredibly simple. It's low to no cost. You can do it even in cold Canada. You can do it in the wintertime. That's my go-to. I try to walk at lunchtime. Even if it's raining, put a rain jacket on. You can still go out for a walk. It's easy. It's really good for our mental health. And in fact, I had a professor at St. Thomas when I was doing my undergrad in psychology, she was an expert in women's depression. And at the time, this was probably, I don't know, about 15 years ago. And at the time, there was a study she was talking about that they used a walking intervention, and it was as effective as an antidepressant for women with moderate levels of depression. And I remember that course just because she was a really cool professor, but I remember that specific class because I was just like, whoa, plain old walking is as effective in this study as an antidepressant. Now, the question is, why don't we hear about this as much? My argument is you can't monetize walking. There isn't as much research done on walking. There's lots of research done on antidepressants. And I'm also not claiming that this is going to cure depression. But there is more and more research. I read some recent stuff last year because I wanted to see what does the literature reflect currently. And there was a study done at a psychiatric facility with individuals suffering from very severe versions of mental illnesses, so severe schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and so on. And they used a walking intervention with this group, and it didn't cure their mental illness. But what they did notice is it did reduce symptoms, and they compared it to a control group. So something as simple as walking that we can build into our routine. The number they say is about 30 minutes a day of vigorous walking. And I know personally, so I can talk about all the research, but personally, walking has helped me pull myself out of a burnout when I was out west, which looked a lot like depression, but it was more an environmental burnout. And I walk now to balance my mental health. I find and I can feel it when I get off track and I'm not walking, I kind of feel, but it just cleans out the cobwebs, lets my kind of head thoughts run. I find I come up with some of my most creative ideas for my podcast and all kinds of things when I'm out for a walk. There's all kinds of benefits from walking. Once again, walking, going to the gym, yoga, snowshoeing, canoeing. We're entering canoeing and kayaking season. It really doesn't matter. It's just get the body moving. We're not built, same as we're not built to be alone and isolated for extended periods of time. We are not built to be sedentary. However, our world has become so convenient and comfortable that we really have to sometimes kind of push back against that and make sure we're getting out and getting the physical activity. And when we do, mental health benefits are going to be quite exponential. And this is also something I do with my clients. The second question that I usually ask, okay, what's your physical activity look like? Because I want to find out kind of some of the environmental things on the baseline before we get into the more complex, changing our thoughts and that kind of stuff. So that's pillar number 2. Number 3 is nature. So you're probably getting the theme now, we are the most disconnected from Mother Nature currently than we've ever been in history. Now, I will put an asterisk there because the last 2 years, one of the silver linings, and there are a number of silver linings from this pandemic. There's lots of crappy stuff, but there are some good things. There has been a back to nature movement. I'm a big nature guy, and if you want to get a canoe, if you want to get a mountain bike, there were points. I don't know what it's like right now, but there has been such a back to nature push because people couldn't go down south, because people were locked at home. People were like, okay, maybe I got to explore my own backyard here. And we've seen a huge increase in getting back to nature. So previous to the pandemic, we were the most disconnected from nature ever in history. Not sure what the updated research is in the last 2 years, but we still got a lot of room to grow. Now, once again, when we look at our evolutionary past, up until about 200 years ago, we've lived with and around, very immersed in nature. We either, for the agrarian revolution, those years, we either owned a farm or worked on a farm or worked in logging industries. And then previous to that, in the hunter-gatherer times, we were truly immersed in nature. So nature really surrounded us. We were highly connected. We now live a very indoor, sedentary, isolated existence. Our brain has also not evolved yet, and hopefully it won't get there, but we haven't evolved to be divorced from nature. Nature is ingrained. And when I was doing this talk at a high school conference last year here in Miramichi, and one of the youth said, it's not us and nature, we are nature. And I was like, yes, that's a great way to put it, is we are part of nature. But what happened is we've kind of compartmentalized, humans. We work in schools, we live in houses, we kind of really divorce ourselves from nature. And there are mental health ramifications because of that too. Now, there's been some really cool research done in Japan. Deneen actually referenced this right at the beginning of the call, talked about forest bathing. They've done quite a bit of research over there looking at what are the mental health benefits when someone goes out and immerses themselves in nature. Now, in Japan, they call it forest bathing. In New Brunswick, or at least in Miramichi, we would say it's just going out in the woods. Because we're very fortunate here, we are surrounded with nature. Like anywhere in New Brunswick, even in Fredericton, Moncton, St. John, our bigger centers, you don't have to go very far. You can probably stay within the city. There's lots of great parks. And then you can go 20 minutes outside of the city and really have some great rivers and boreal forest to kind of escape to. And so in Japan, they did this research, and they noticed that and they were tracking their people's brain waves, and as soon as people got out in nature, the brain started to calm down instantaneously. And they noticed there was this de-stimulating effect of nature. And then there's been further research and more kind of clarification on what's happening. And what it is our senses, so our smell, our sight, nature is a natural sensory experience. So the smells are natural, the sounds are natural. So the trickling sounds of a brook or a bird song or the wind going through the leaves, visually, it's natural. They call it fractals. So, human-made experience, I think I'm blurred here in my background, but you think of like brick buildings or this brick wall, these perfectly made corners. Nature doesn't have any perfect corners. It's kind of like it's nature's perfect imperfection. And visually, that's really destimulating. There's no noise pollution, so cars, the humming of the heater in the background, the humming of a computer, light pollution, all of these things overstimulate our brain, and they're also super new. They're like in the last 100 to 200 years. We haven't evolved yet to be able to handle all this overstimulation. Now, I'm not saying that we got to go and be recluse and live in the woods and live off the grid. I know some people that do that, and great, but for most of us, that's not possible. I still have to work an office job. I'm on my computer most of the day. What we need to do is say, okay, how do we go out and get those magic moments in nature to help balance the system? And some people will say, well, I'm not big into going, on these big canoe trips or these big hiking adventures. And, I'm not a nature person. I would argue, well, we're all nature people, every one of us. It's through our evolution. Some of us have just unlearned that have lost that ability to connect. But the other thing too is we don't need to make it super complex. It can be as simple as going out on some green space in our backyard or outside of our school or our office. It could be going to a park. Anything that has some type of natural environment is going to help destimulate our brain. And it doesn't have to be these big, extravagant canoe trips or backcountry trips. Those are great. I would argue they're probably even better, but they're not for everyone. But it's just what we say in my house is balancing green time and screen time, right? Getting that green time or blue time. Research shows that being by a waterway, which any of you that are from, Fredericton, St. John, Moncton, there's lots of great waterways. The St. John River runs through Fredericton and St. John. You got different river systems in Moncton. We got the mighty Miramichi here. Just going for a walk or spending some time by blue waterways or lakes, very destimulating, connects back to our primitive self. Incredibly powerful. So I want you to reflect on how much nature do you have in your life? And I'm sure some people right away are going to say, well, I just don't have the time. I don't have the time. It's like, well, at the end of the day, if you're not willing to make the time for your mental health, then you're not going to get the benefits, right? Some of this stuff we do need to build into a routine. I know myself, I'm naturally a nature person. I grew up in the country. I spent a lot of time. I don't get out nearly as much as I really would want to. I'm trying to build more of it in. But every year I'm trying to kind of get more of those minutes. And they say about 20 minutes 3 times a week. So an hour a week of it getting out in some type of green or blue space can really have fundamental effects on our mental health. So that's number 3, reconnecting with Mother Nature. It's simple, it's free. There is research being done. I'm really interested in wilderness therapy. So it's an existing field that's been around for a couple decades or longer. But there's more and more research now being done to show taking kids and adults and people with addictions out in a nature setting and conducting therapy through group and changing the setting, changing the modality a little bit. There's a ton of stuff coming back now that this is really, really powerful versus sitting in an office talking to a therapist, which works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for some people. So changing the medium or the environment is really cool. So that's a passion project of mine. I'm looking to get more experience in it and hopefully be able to practice wilderness-based therapy down the road, merging another passion of mine, or 2 passions. Number 4 is our sleep. So I'm just gonna take a quick drink and pour it all over my shirt. We are, as you're probably getting the vibe now, we are the most sleep deprived than we've ever been in history. So the millennials, which is my generation, we literally just handed the torch over to my kids' generation, Gen Z, because we were the most sleep deprived. But It seems like every generation is like, oh, kids these days, right? It's like once that generation gets into their 30s, we blame everything else on the next generation. The reality is the last generation to actually sleep well was my grandmother's generation, which they call them the matures. They did a study back in the 1940s, a Gallup poll, and they were we're sleeping, I think it's like an hour and a quarter less than we did from the 1940s to like the 2010, I think, whenever this follow-up was done. So, and life arguably was not easy or was not stress-free in the 1940s. Life was probably pretty hard, but life was a lot different. We weren't inundated with all the different noise and visual pollutions and high technologies. People were very highly connected. People were very physically active. There was all these variables that were happening, and I think people just prioritized their sleep. Nowadays, and Arnold Schwarzenegger has, unfortunately, he's done some damage in just kind of putting out the narrative that, well, you know what, just sleep faster or sleep less if you want to get more done. That's not a good way to look at it, right? We need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep is the window for the average person. And I think right now the average person in North America is getting like 6.25. So we're well under the bottom line of that. We are all very sleep deprived. Sleep is one of those things that we can go a while with maybe being, isolated. We can go a while without exercise and engaging in nature. We cannot go very long without proper sleep until it starts to impede measurably. We can actually measure how much it impedes on our mental and physical functioning. In fact, one bad night of sleep deprivation, and they've done lots of research on this. Dr. Matthew Walker, if you want to read up on his stuff, he wrote the book Why We Sleep. Phenomenal, game changer, one of the best books I've ever read. They've done lots of research in their sleep labs, and just one night of sleep deprivation, they can measure the people the next day. Their memory is not as good, their ability to concentrate, their mood, how irritable they are, all of these things were decreased. One night of sleep. Now, not drastically, but I think they only let them sleep 5 or 6 hours. So if only one night of bad sleep, imagine multiple nights. Imagine that you haven't slept properly for weeks or months and so on. So the cool thing is there's lots of things we can do that are very simple that can really dial in our sleep. And then if they don't work, then we probably need to maybe reach out for some professional help. So some things are, if you think of, like, I have 4 kids at home, and we have a pretty dialed in sleep wind down routine. So my little guy goes to bed, jammies on, grab him some milk, I read him a book, kind of the same thing every night at the same time. So we have a routine that we do that wind down, and it's the same time. So consistency between 6:15, time for Kyron to go to bed. My daughter next up in line around 7 o'clock, between 6:30 and 7. Same thing. Get jammies on, get a snack, go up, read some books, mom and dad, and then our 2 bigs that are 8 and 10, 8 o'clock. But we do this routine every single night, and our brain really likes consistency. But what happens is when we get older, teenagers and adults, a lot of us adults are guilty of this, our routine's kind of all over the place. We go to bed at 9 o'clock one night, and then we're going to bed at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock because we just want to watch that last series of Ozark or whatever it is. And we're staying up later, going to bed earlier, we're having naps, we have no wind down routine. We're on our phones right till we go to bed. So if we implement some of these very basic things, it really can, our brain wants consistency. And what it does, it rewards us if we start to have a wind down, like my wife, she has a warm bath at night, and there's actually research on, it's called vasodilation, I think, is when you have a hot bath, it actually pulls your core temperature out to your skin. And it actually cools down your core temperature, which you would think would be the contrary. But that's a really good way to help kind of initiate that sleep and calm the system down. Myself, I'm a reader. I read probably half an hour to 45 minutes before I go to bed, to the point now I have my brain so conditioned I can't fall asleep without reading something. So when I go on a backcountry canoe trip, I actually bring books and I'm reading in my tent because my brain has been conditioned. So having a routine is really important. Caffeine consumption. Caffeine has a half-life of, I think, like 5 to 6 hours. So half of the caffeine is still in your system 5 to 6 hours later. So if you struggle with sleep, afternoon caffeine consumption, it'd be probably worthwhile to consider cutting that back. I'm caffeine sensitive, so I don't drink any caffeine. I don't need it. I probably have enough energy naturally. Alcohol. So some people think, well, alcohol, having that one drink of wine or a drink of beer helps me relax, whatever. When you fall asleep because maybe one too many beer or wine, it's actually not sleep. From a brain perspective, when they put an MRI scanner on your head, and if you're passed out because you drank too much alcohol, you're sedated, which is not the same. You don't fall into sleep stages. So you can technically pass out for, say, 6 hours or whatever. Your brain is not actually in REM sleep or non-REM sleep, those stages where it actually restores and recharges. So when people think, oh, having that toddy at nighttime helps me relax, yeah, it may help you actually fall asleep, but it's delaying how long it takes you to get into actual sleep. So that's another one. Having routines, making sure your bedroom is, and once again, if you sleep great and your kids sleep great, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. But if you're struggling with some of these things, you need to look at some of these and start to dial them back in. Making sure your bedroom is only for sleep and romantic relationships. Those two things. Keep your bedroom as a sacred space, because if you have a TV in your bedroom, if you bring your phone to your bedroom, if you do work in your bedroom, your brain is going to associate. We're associative species. We associate things with other things. Your brain associates work, which is when you're up and alert and probably drinking coffee, or your screens, which are stimulating. It associates that space with those particular activities, which those are not activities you want to be associating with when you're supposed to be winding down and falling into restful sleep. So we really need to look at our environments. That's something that's probably the third or fourth question I ask my clients. How's your sleep? Because we know every single mental illness, one of the symptoms is sleep dysregulation. Now, is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the sleep dysregulation that causes the mental illness? Is it the mental illness? I don't know. It's kind of back and forth. But for sure, you can take someone and deprive them of sleep for, a week, and we will start to see heightened symptoms of anxiety, of depression, and downright psychosis. If you deprive someone of sleep enough, they will actually can lose touch with reality. So this is something that is very precious that we really need to dial in and make sure we're prioritized. It's not easy. I've been working on this pillar for a long time, to the point now where there's lots of nights by the time our house gets quiet and the dog goes to bed. I'd love to be able to, from 9 to 11, just sit or 9 to midnight, sit and watch some shows. And sometimes we do, but a lot of times I'm like, no, what? I need that extra hour of sleep. I'd love to stay up, and I know it'd be nice to veg out, but my body needs that extra. I need to get my 7 to 9 hours tonight, because if I don't, it really throws myself off. And I'm really big into, like I said, trying to get things to thrive. I want to try to thrive as a human being, and also have people around me and different things around me as well. So sleep, really important. If you are a reader, I don't know if I have the book here. I guess I'm probably blurred in the background anyways. Why We Sleep, Dr. Matthew Walker, game changer book, really, really informative. He's a professor. He was a professor at Harvard. I think he's out of UC Berkeley now. He's been doing this stuff for 20 years. He's been researching sleep. He's got a sleep lab. It's really, really well written. It's not super academic either. I don't really like those really high academia books. It breaks it down really, really good. And it's kind of scary, some of the stuff you'll learn about how sleep deprived we are and the ramifications, both physically and mentally. So pillar number 4, really need to dial in your sleep. You can also just Google sleep diaries. You can get rings, or you can get apps for your watches that can help track your sleep. That's really good to see, are you getting enough proper deep REM sleep, non-REM sleep, so on and so forth. And then there's just different things you can do. But if you struggle with insomnia, the number one recommendation now from the research is don't go for a sleeping pill. We're finding out now that they're really can be quite dangerous. They can be used obviously in extreme situations, but right now one of the most effective forms of treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So it's a type of therapy for insomnia, and I believe Mike LeBlanc is actually talking about that maybe this week, CBTI. So I would highly recommend checking that out about the sleep.
John, can I interrupt real quick?
Sure can.
Just because there's a question in the chat, and thank you for plugging in Michael's session tomorrow, because we are doing a session on CBT sleep insomnia, because it's such a important issue to many of teachers and professionals. But there's a question in the chat. It's a great question from Greg Manuel. I believe it's one of my UMB students. He said, what about oversleep?
Yeah, so I don't know as much about oversleep. I know it's not good either. So 7 to 9 seems to be the magic number. And I know Dr. Walker doesn't talk a whole lot about oversleeping. That sometimes can be a symptom of some type of mental health problem or concern, undersleeping or oversleeping and still not feeling rested. I think the go-to is if your body, if you're dialing things in and you're consistent, and you're really prioritizing going to bed at the right time, doing the good wind down, reducing screen time, all that kind of stuff, and you're giving yourself a sleep window from 7 to 9 hours, but your body is continually needing 10, 11, 12, and you're still not feeling rested, then there could be something happening there, because you could be sleeping for 10 to 12 hours, but within your sleep, maybe you're not hitting those restorative pieces, those restorative stages like REM sleep and the non-REM sleep. You may just be hitting that light wave sleep. So that one I don't know as much about the oversleeping, but I am going to make a note because that is something I'm kind of curious about too.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so our fifth pillar is diet, and not like the fad diets, Atkins or paleo or keto or Noom is a big one. It's what are we eating, like our actual diet, and this is a newer area of research, and within our diet, particularly our gut health. So how healthy our gut is, and we feed this thing with our diet. So I've been doing a lot of reading the last couple of years, read some really cool books and following the research, and it's a very new area of research. But what they're looking at is they're calling our gut. So our organ that they used to thought was pretty primitive, they've coined it now our second brain, because it's so complex. I think 80% or 90% of our serotonin, which is like our mood chemical that keeps us regulated, is stored in our gut, not in our brain. There's the vagal nerve, the vagus nerve, that's connected from our brain, that's activated when we deep breathe. There's this gut-brain connection that researchers are now finding that when our gut is healthy, particularly our gut biome, so the ecosystem within our gut, because we talked about ecological mental health, when our gut biome is nice and balanced, our brain, it helps obviously balance our brain. They're even experimenting now. I don't know any of the results, but in the book that I just read from this medical doctor this past year, they're experimenting with gut treatments, trying to balance the gut biome with probiotics and prebiotics to treat anxiety and depression, which I think is pretty phenomenal, because right now the main way to treat anxiety and depression is through talk therapy, so through thoughts and through medication. So now they're starting to experiment with this. So when we look at our diet, same thing as the other four pillars, we arguably, and I don't think this one's hard to argue with, at least in the Western world, in North America, we have the worst diet we've ever had in history. We probably arguably have the worst diet in the world. And I'm obviously generalizing, right? I'm not saying each one of you individually. Some people eat really healthy, but as a society, our diet consists of very high processed. The question of the kind of task is always, okay, what are you eating? How close is it to its original form? So if we look at in the picture, that chunk of salmon, well, that's the salmon, it's original form. Those tomatoes, those beans, those asparagus, even the rice, well, there's some processing there, right? It had to be dehydrated and milled and so on, but it's still pretty true to its form. When you get a loaf of bread, when you get a pizza pocket, what's the traditional form? Well, that was wheat. Pepperoni, well, there's a ton of processing that goes back to pork. So our diet is so over processed, and I'm guilty of this. This is my pillar that I've been really working on since January, because I did have it dialed in years ago, and I've recently clamped down, and I got about 25 pounds down, and it's really less about losing the weight. I'm really fascinated with making sure my gut is really healthy. So when we don't have enough pre and probiotics, so those really good bacteria, which would be our probiotics, and our prebiotics is our high fiber foods like broccoli and vegetables and fruit, and legumes and beans and all that kind of stuff. When we have a good balance of probiotics and prebiotics, that is two very big important factors that keep a really good healthy gut. Another thing, which tapping back to farming for mental health, actually dirt, and you can Google this. It's pretty interesting. I was just talking to someone a couple nights ago, a local gardener that I was out fishing with, and we were talking about how there's actually and there's quite a bit of science now. There's a microbacteria in dirt, and when we joke about like I want my kids to eat dirt, right, because it's good for them to get out and get their hands dirty. There's actually a microbacteria or plural microbacteria in dirt that is really good for our gut. So when my kids are out in the garden and they're playing and they're getting dirty, there's stuff that they may breathe in, like, stuff that you can't even see if it's a little dusty or whatever. It's really good for our stomachs. Because if you think of evolution, we've evolved in nature for, the majority of our existence around all the stuff. And then the last 100 or so years, in particular the last 2 years, we've became so super sanitized that we've pretty much, and high levels of antibiotics, we've basically killed this really healthy gut biome in our stomach. And we're starting to see that that's not the only reason, but it's another contributing factor to why we are so out of balance mentally. So that's another thing I am recommending now. I'm not a naturopath or a dietitian, or I don't have any of that training. But I always, with my clients, I recommend, hey, go to a naturopathic doctor and have a conversation about, particularly ask them about gut health. And there's a really cool naturopathic doctor here in town that I know a little bit, and I'm probably going to link up a bit more and send some of my clients there, and vice versa, because at the end of the day, our diet really does, particularly the foods that are feeding our gut health. It really does make a difference. And I've been focusing on that the last, since January. I do feel it is making a difference. It's anecdotal. I can't scientifically say because I also am walking more and I'm just generally eating healthier. But I do feel like there's a benefit there. So our diet, it's not about cutting everything out. I forget who it was that had kind of a different approach. And they said, instead of trying to restrict everything, one way to look at it is, okay, what can we add more good stuff in? Maybe, and if it's too hard to get enough probiotics or prebiotics, you can get supplements that there's a fermented coconut liquid that you can take a tablespoon a day, and it's got like 1 trillion microbacteria or whatever. You can make it a lot easier with some very basic supplementation, or you can just try to eat more like kefir and yogurt and sauerkraut and fermented foods, which would be your probiotics, and then lots of fiber-rich foods like your beans, your broccoli, your fruits and vegetables. If you just do that, not only are you going to feed your gut, but you're just going to feel better because you're eating cleaner, less processed food. So that's pillar number 5. The big takeaway, hopefully, I've laid the groundwork. I just want you guys to think of your mental health and your physical health, but this is more focused on mental health from an ecological perspective. What are those things in your life? And there's more than 5, right? These are just my 5 big pillars. What are things, maybe spirituality or faith is a pillar for you, and you feel, and that is for a lot of people. Maybe it's meditation, maybe whatever. Think of other things that are, but I would argue these 5 are absolutely foundational. And then there can be lots of other things too. What is out of balance? And I would argue, I've been thinking about this and I practice this. I don't have these 5 mastered. I need to work still on my social connectedness. I have a pretty good group of friends and family members, but there's still room for improvement there. Physical activity, absolutely. I mean, I walk relatively consistently. That's something I need to get more on my routine, particularly in the wintertime when things really slow down and we're indoors. Major room for improvement there. Nature, I do live on a farm, but our front yard is in an urban neighborhood. Our backyard is kind of a rural farm, so it's kind of the best of both worlds. But I need way more nature in my life. It's fishing season, so I'm getting lots this past couple of weeks and for the next month or so. Sleep, that one I have pretty dialed in. Diet, still working on there. So I would argue anybody that's listening to this call, or if I surveyed the general population, I don't think most of us will have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of these things that are out of balance. I would say find out the one that is the most out of balance, and that's where you start. Don't try to accomplish everything at once. If it's your diet that you want to focus on, great. Dial in and focus on that for the next couple months. If it's your social connectedness, if you got the energy and you want to focus on a couple, but just don't overwhelm yourself, and understand this isn't like okay, I got all 5 done, check mark. This is a lifelong thing that we need to make sure we have dialed in, among other pillars in your life. Like I said, spirituality, meditation, community, all that kind of stuff that you feel is important for you. So think of your ecosystem. Use this gardening metaphor, because my back garden that I'm just getting prepped right now, my personal garden, if I leave it and don't do anything with it this year, it is going to be overcome with weeds. But if I go and put the work, and it does take work, it takes a lot of work and effort, I can make a really beautiful, productive garden that can grow fruits and vegetables, that can really thrive. But it takes a lot of work and commitment, and that is something we have to be able to put the time and effort in. And in a world of quick fix, instant gratification, it is hard, for myself included, but our mental health is the same thing. We really need to make sure these 5 pillars are in place, because then, and I see this with my clients, when they start to work on these 5 pillars, then when we get into cognitive behavioral therapy and really start to change core beliefs and thoughts, they engage in therapy better. Their motivation increases because they got more energy from a good diet. They slept better at night. They're hanging out with good people that lift them up. And then they engage better in therapy. So it's a win-win. It's kind of like the foundation. I like to have this foundation in place before we go into therapy. So it's really something that, regardless if you're struggling with a mental illness or not, it's something all of us, I think everywhere, we need to make sure we have dialed in. So with that, I would just want you to think of what are things, I gave you some tips and tricks to work on, but I really, hopefully, the biggest thing I want to leave you with is just to reflect on what are the things in your life, particularly of these 5, that are out of balance. And I did this session at one of our high schools just a couple weeks ago. One of the teachers came up who I know personally, and he's like, "Oh man," he goes, I really need to focus on most of these 5, right?" And that's what I want. I want people to start to think and go, okay, think about it, then you got to take action. And if you need to reach out to people for support, if you need to reach out professional support, whatever you need to do to help balance these 5 pillars, do it, because I promise you, you will feel your quality of life will increase. It's not going to cure everything. It's not going to make life easy and happy every single day, which that's not normal either. But you will feel better. Your students will learn better. You'll have better relationships, your kids at home, your partners, your friends, your family, and so on. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your time. Obviously, I can stay around if there are any questions. And there is my email. If you do have any questions, if you're like me and you think of something like an hour later or the next week, just fire me an email. Like the question that was asked from Mr. Manuel, I don't know the oversleeping piece, but what I am good at is I'm now going to go and look into that myself, because that is something I don't know as much about the oversleeping. I know undersleeping's bad, but I'm pretty good, at least if I don't know it, I can probably point you in the right direction, give you some resources that you can then hopefully find the information out yourself. So thank you all for your ears, and to Neen for setting this up.
That was awesome, John. Thank you so much. I just put your email in the chat there because sometimes people go back to the chats to get the information. And I will probably put the Center of Excellence website in there as well, because this session is recorded and it will be shared for many months. So really love that you say that it's a lifelong journey. It's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. And I think sometimes we get overwhelmed, even with the number 5 of the 5 different pillars, and we have to kind of hit all 5 of those pillars. And I would agree with you that, looking at one at a time and trying not to even make that one pillar so overwhelming and so, I guess, intense that it becomes a negative. And I know that when I was doing nutrition counseling and different things like that, I would just say, you know what, let's just change one thing for the month. Maybe it's water. Maybe it's, like you said, increasing the good food, not saying I can't have this or I can't have that. And as soon as I know my brain, as soon as I say I can't have my yummy cheesecake or chocolate, that's all I think about. So I do want to open the floor for any questions. I always have questions, but if there's anybody on the call that would like to put their camera on and ask a question, we'd love to have that. Or if you just like to keep your camera off, that's wonderful as well. And while people are thinking about a question, I have one. First of all, if you're an Ozark fan, I am amazing. Like, I just love Ozark. I think it's absolutely fabulous. So kudos to you. Great show to watch.
It's one of the best. I think one of the best dramas, or best, whatever you would consider it, but one of the best series.
Absolutely. Social connectedness, that's something that I do not have a problem with. But I do have people in my family that I can see it is a struggle. And maybe, I mean, I don't think everyone needs to be an extrovert or the life of the party or have 1,000 friends, because I don't have many friends, but I have very I'm going to say particular friends that I choose. And, but what I struggle with is when I see family members that are not making social connectedness a priority, and how to motivate them and at the same time not judge them or make them feel worse about it. I would love some, I guess, maybe some thoughts around that.
Yeah, that can be a tricky one, because I experience it too, both in my clinical work and even just with family and friends. It's one of those things I think we have to be very delicate, because like I said, we don't want to be judgmental. We don't want to, I think, presenting the information, even like the conversation we're having today, just having that conversation, presenting the importance of social connectedness. Depending on the person, some people, need to see that and they go, oh, geez, I didn't realize how this is affecting my mental, physical health. Some people respond to very well to, yeah, I'll let you help advocate and maybe get me out a little bit. Some people don't. I think it's a subjective thing. I think knowing how the person works individually, and how you can advocate for them. Like I said, some people will be like, yeah, totally, introduce me to some new people, bring me out to some new events or whatever, where other people may be more resistant. And it's like the old saying, you can only lead a horse to water, right? Like in therapy, we always talk about, if the therapist is working harder than the client, that's not good, right? So as a friend, I think presenting the information, or as a friend or family member, presenting the information, kind of planting those seeds is important. And then trying to, be that puppeteer in the background that maybe, hey, invite people out to creating opportunities where maybe they can connect. But at the end of the day, the person needs to kind of buy in too, right? You can only create so much. So I guess that would be thinking of people in my life. I know there's some people that are very close with it. I've had this exact conversation with, that are more introverted, and there is a difference in personality from introversion to extroversion. And I just remind this one person, I'm like, I look at it as an insurance thing, is if something really tragic happens and adversity does strike all of us at different times in our life, do you right now have the social connections that can help you get through that adversity? And I know myself, if tragedy strikes, I feel pretty good. I got a pretty good group of family and friends that if something horrific happened, I'm probably going to be able to bounce. At least got people to lean on. And I had this conversation with this individual, and it was a wake up call to them. They're like, ooh, well, I got like one person, right? And so, once again, knowing how to have the conversation with the particular person, I think is important. Knowledge is the first piece, and then creating opportunities where you can maybe help them kind of make those connections as well.
Tricking them into the going, you mean?
Hey, being manipulative in a good way.
That's right.
Influential. Shouldn't say
That's right.
manipulative. Yeah.
Thank you Nope, I'm muted.
There.
I just put in the chat the website, and the only reason I'm putting that there so that you can go back and get the recorded session. So it will be posted by tomorrow. But John, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. I think you've hit the nail on the head with the 5 pillars, and I really appreciate how down to earth and easy the pillars are, and you explain them in a beautiful way that I think most people can grasp onto. So thank you for, again, for presenting and offering your email for contacts and future contacts. I just got a text from a friend that was on the call, or a coworker, and said that she'd love to reach out to you. So certainly thank you so much for being who you are in New Brunswick. You're making a difference. I know that for fact. I've seen your work in play for the last 8-9 months. So it's been a pleasure. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you as well, Deneen, and for everybody that tuned in and will tune in maybe after.
Awesome.